Let's get down to some good work here. We left off with the conclusion of last week's part 1 of 2 parts for the book of Samuel, Samuel's 1 and 2. And you might recall that both Jonathan and Saul are killed, they die. The second work of the book of Samuel begins with some variant, a discrepancy, open for interpretation, open for more critical analysis of a text, that is, conversion stories that are interwoven to create at least a uniform presentation. We know that with regard to basic biblical criticism, documentary hypothesis, the idea that there are complementary and in some cases contradictory stories of the same theme. There are 2 creation stories in the book of Genesis, what are referred to as doublets. There are theories that there are political undertones that help give rise to the text itself. The priestly documents, the Elohim documents, the Yahwist document, and so on. Theological angles, political angles, and the such. So I'm going to leave you to your own devices, but I do call to your attention the opening of the second work of Samuel and contrast and compare that to the end of the first work of Samuel because of the discrepancy that at least vaguely I alert you to. The text then unfolds with a very beautiful eulogy that David gives to Saul and to Jonathan. And here I'm referring to chapter 1 in the second book of Samuel. And let's just quickly look at verse 19. So Samuel 2, verse 19, chapter 1. I'm going to read only because my text is different. I'm assuming your text is derived from the same book, same translation. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your heights, referring to Mount Gilboa. That is a mountain range southeast slightly of the Galilee, the Sea of Galilee. So you can picture Israel, the Galilee up to the north, slightly south and to its east. How have the mighty fallen? Tell it not in Gath. Do not proclaim in the streets of Ashkelon, lest the daughters of the Philistines rejoice, lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. O hills of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain on you, O bountiful fields. And then it goes on, very poetic, melodic, and so on. Remember, the Philistines were the ones with whom the Israelites were in battle. The Philistines were a seafaring group bordered on the Mediterranean, from which later in the 1st century, the Romans will conquer Israel and rename it Palestine. You can hear the alliterative similarities, Philistines, Palestine. The story unfolds and David conquers Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a Jebusite city. Again, you can hear the alliterative similarity. In Hebrew, it's Yerushalayim, and the Jebusites. It is a strategic stronghold, and this is important. David is the quintessential military man, and he knew then, as we know now, that whoever has control of the high ground has a military advantage. If you are the king of the hill, you can see what's coming your way, literally. I don't mean that metaphorically. If you have control on the top of the hill, top of the mountain, you can see what's coming at you. You are in a position where you can defend yourself more capably than those who are coming up to try to overcome you. That's true in modern warfare as well. Whoever controls the skies controls the ground. And as we move deeper into the 21st century, whoever controls space controls the earth. And that is just a fact, as it were, in terms of high ground and advantages that they bring. Jerusalem is about 2,000 feet above sea level. Those of you who have ever visited Israel, you land in Ben Gurion Airport, the international airport of Israel, which is bordered on the Mediterranean Sea. And as you make your drive up to Jerusalem, your ears have to acclimate to the rise in the elevation. It is also within the tribe of Benjamin. And if you can visualize a map of Israel, it's somewhat in the middle. And the fact that it is not officially part of Benjamin when King David conquers it is an important note as well. Think of Washington, D.C. If Washington, D.C. were within the confines of a state, we could understand certainly during the formulation of the United States that there may be concerns for nepotism, jealousy, collusion of some sort. Well, the nation's capital is in Virginia, so all of a sudden we would think the Virginians might have some advantage in terms of governmental policy or local policy. And to preempt that, neutrality is important, or at least perceived neutrality is important. And same thing with Jerusalem. It's a Jebusite city. David conquers the Jebusites, and he declares that Jerusalem is the site where the holy Ark of the Covenant, which houses the Ten Commandments, which is in Shiloh in the tribe of Ephraim, slight farther north. All right, I don't have my, would it help for me to, you know what, actually, let me just do this. Ah, it's here, good. So we're going to establish one thing. I tell the jokes around here. Now, the easterlies will come in from the south, raising some low pressure that comes in from the sea. I did that last week, and I can't help myself. I have to do it again. So here is Jerusalem, and this is the Kinneret, or the Sea of Galilee, in Hebrew Kinneret. This is the Dead Sea. And the Ark of the Covenant was located somewhere around here in the tribe of Ephraim. Manasseh is here, and it goes east of what would be the Jordan River. And the Ark of the Covenant is brought into Jerusalem. And this is before the temple is built, the epicenter, the social, economic, religious, cultural epicenter of ancient Israel, the temple itself and the temple compound, of which there are remnants in terms of the retaining wall of the second, and believed some of the structure, or at least some of the boulders that were used for the first temple. What's going to happen, though, and before we get into what I really want to focus in on the time that we have together this morning, is that David is going to be told by the prophet Nathan that he cannot build the temple. He conquers Jerusalem. It is the site wherein the temple compound will be built strategically, militarily. It is a fortified and will be even more fortified area. It is above, significantly above sea level. It is a highly defensible area. But he is told summarily by the prophet Nathan that he will not be able to build the temple. One of his descendants, undisclosed at this point, will. Now, the plot thickens, and here's where I want us to refer more specifically to the book itself. It thickens insofar as we see an aspect of King David that may be surprising to those for whom they're unfamiliar, and very curious as to why it is even included in the canon of the Bible. But along those lines, why certain very undesirable events are included in the Bible, in the canon, I would argue speaks to both its relevance and its honesty. You can sanitize this text, you can edit it on your own, but the fact that it's not, the fact that essentially it's NC-17 indicates to me how real it is, and for that matter, gives all of us a sense of pause and maybe a point of entry that we can relate to it more on our own terms, as it were. This is an extreme example. Open up your text or turn to your text, as the case may be, to chapter 11, 2 Samuel chapter 11. And here I want to do some reading with you and to analyze a little bit more in depth. First of all, the word David means beloved. Reverend, you are beloved. The biblical work, Song of Songs, which is quite erotic. Let's not, try to analogize it as a love letter between Israel and God. It is erotica, there's no question about it, but there's a line in Song of Songs, Ani lidodi vidodi li. I am my beloved, and my beloved is mine. Dodi, Davi. You can hear the alliterative similarity, and the root structure is the same. David meaning beloved. Chapter 11. At the turn of the year, the season when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab. What does it mean, the season when the kings go out to battle?
In Ukraine right now, right?
Yeah, it is. But specifically, just for pragmatic considerations, when is this? Why springtime? Well, the weather. What?
Travel season.
Yes, that's right. And remember, Israel has very cold, rainy, and at times even snowy winters. You get bogged down. David sent Joab with his officers and all Israel with him, and they devastated Amnon and besieged Rabbah. David remained in Jerusalem. Late one afternoon, David rose from his couch and strolled on the roof of the royal palace. You can just see this, all the guys are out fighting his battles, and, he's reading the newspaper, took a nap, and just, put on his slippers and went out to the balcony. And from the roof, he saw a woman bathing. The woman was very beautiful, and the king sent someone to make inquiries about the woman. He reported she is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite. Let me just unpack some of the names here. Bathsheba can mean daughter of the oath. Sheva is also 7, daughter of 7, but Sheva has the same root as Shavuah or Shva, which is an oath. So a daughter of the oath. And Eliam means God is my nation. All right, so the names themselves, I think, are really very curious. Uriah or Uriah means God is my light. He reported, she is Bathsheba, daughter of Eliam and wife of Uriah the Hittite. David sent messengers to fetch her. She came to him and he lay with her. She had just purified herself after her period and she went back home. This is just really crude and staccato-like. King David says something and you say, yes, sir. He says, jump, and you say, how high? The foreshadowing here, and even just the expansion of the sentence itself, gives insight. She just purified herself after her period, which means what? She's fertile. She's at the most fertile time in her cycle. And obviously that's significant. And does she consent to this? We don't know. You get the sense that this is certainly a date rape. The woman conceived and she sent word to David. And this is, it's stingingly, humorous, but there's nothing funny about this. It's like, Your Highness, I have some news to share with you. And of course, she's pregnant. Thereupon, David sent a message to Joab, and Joab is this very loyal attendant to the king. Send Uriah the Hittite to me, and continue. And Joab sent Uriah to David. You with me, folks? We're about to start verse 7. We're not there quite yet.
Quick question.
Yes.
Is Uriah a Jew?
I don't know. It's a fair question.
Is Bathsheba a Jew?
Yeah, well, we're using the term somewhat out of the contents of history. Bathsheba, yes. I don't know about Uriah. It's a fair, I don't know. He's a Hittite, and the Hittites come from Anatolia, which is Turkey. But I don't know if he's a Jew.
So it doesn't necessarily reflect an ethnic as opposed to geographic origin. But it's a distraction.
No. Your question's in bounds. It's funny. I'd have to think about it. And I don't want to fudge an answer. I do know this, and I know it simply by reading the text. He's unflinchingly loyal to King David. That much we do know. His party lines are very clear.
Michael, probably if he's Jewish, he's converted to Judaism, and oftentimes converts are the most
most passionate, as it were. Yeah, I've often said our imports are better than our exports. Says me, born to an immigrant mother, but yes, yes.
Is there a reason why he didn't just do away with Bathsheba? He's a king, he could have her sent away or killed or something. Is there
a good question? Good question. I'll leave that to our own devices. I don't know.
progresses the story.
Yeah. Well, clearly it does that, but he very easily could have just, had her done away with. Uriah comes home. She had an accident. What have you, whatever. But essentially he does the same thing, but he doesn't do it to her, right?
Yeah, he likes them.
And mind you, this is King David. And mind you, this is from the house of Jesse. And mind you, this is one family tree that a messianic line of which, and I know before whom I stand, Jesus himself is derived, right? Or the Messiah, the notion of the Messiah is notion in general of the Messiah, specific Jesus. Is derived, which raises all kinds of questions by itself. Let's go on, verse 7. When Uriah came to him, David asked him how Joab and the troops were faring and how the war was going. Then David said to Uriah, go down to your house and bathe your feet. What does that mean? Have sex with your wife. That's exactly what it means. This is a Rorschach test, folks.
Thought she just wanted to have.
Well, maybe he just wanted a pedicure, for God's sakes. All right, the gauntlet is off. Now let's talk. All right, anyway. David said to Uriah, go down to your home and bathe your feet. When Uriah left the royal palace, a present from the king followed him, but Uriah slept at the entrance of the royal palace, along with the other officers of his lord, and did not go down to his house. Again, well, before I even say again, let's read on a little bit more. When David was told that Uriah had not gone down to his house, he said to Uriah, you just came from a journey. Why didn't you go down to your house? Uriah answered David, the ark and Israel and Judah are located at Sukkot, and my master Joab and your master, in your majesty's men are camped in the open. How can I go home and eat and drink and sleep with my wife? As you live by your very life, I will not do this.
Wow.
This is an incredibly decent man. Not that it's indecent at all for him to go and enjoy his wife enjoy him, and have some R&R. Nothing wrong with that. On the contrary. But it's dramatically illustrated here that under no uncertain terms is he willing to do that, because he is so loyal and he's so concerned both about his fellow soldiers, let alone fulfilling the dictate of his king. David said to Uriah, by the way, folks, are you familiar with this story? Are you reasonably familiar with this story? Yeah. David said to Uriah, stay here today also and tomorrow. I will send you off. So Uriah remained in Jerusalem that day. The next day, David summoned him, and he ate and drank with him until he got him drunk. But in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep in the same place. And the Lord's officers, he did not go down with his Lord's officers. He did not go down to his home. In the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab, which he sent with Uriah. This is just so perverted. You read this and you go, wow, this man is diabolical, insane. It just, is that the totality of David? No. But is this something that raises all kinds of flashing red lights? Yes. He wrote a letter as follows: place Uriah in the front line where the fighting is fiercest, then fall back so that he may be killed. So when Joab was besieging the city, he stationed Uriah at the point where he knew that there were able warriors. The men of the city sallied out and attacked Joab. And some of David's officers among the troops fell. Uriah the Hittite was among those who died. Joab sent a full report of the battle to David. He instructed the messenger as follows: when you finish reporting to the king all about the battle, the king may get angry and say to you, why did you come so close to the city to attack it? Didn't you know that they would shout from the wall? Who struck down Abimelech, son of Yerubethshit? Was it not a woman who dropped an upper millstone on him from the wall at Thebez, from which he died? Why did you come so close to the wall? Then say your servant Uriah the Hittite was among those killed. I'm just going to read on, and then we're going to get to the scene with the prophet Nathan. The messenger set out. He came and told David all that Joab had said to him. The messenger said to David, "First the men prevailed against us and sallied out against us into the open. Then we drove them back up to the entrance to the gate. But the archers shot at your men from the wall, and some of your majesty's men fell. Your servant Uriah the Hittite also fell." Whereupon David said to the messenger, "Give Joab this message. Do not be distressed about the matter. The sword always takes its toll. Press your attack on the city and destroy it. Encourage him." When Uriah's wife heard that her husband Uriah was dead, she lamented over her husband. After a period of mourning was over, David sent and had her brought into his palace. She became his wife, and she bore him a son.
Exactly.
Tough stuff. By the way, as a complete aside, so I've grown a beard for 30 days. My father, I mentioned, my father died, now of blessed memory. And there is a custom when one loses a parent, specifically a parent, there's a full year of gradated mourning, or at least in terms of rituals associated, one of which is not to shave for a month. Hence, that's why I have a beard. So that darts back to Bathsheba having a period of mourning, okay? Now, questions, comments, reactions up to this point, anything that comes to mind? Please.
So his story, is classically one of, David has this falling out with God that, he commits this, sends this guy to his death. But another way.
He commits adultery, and he also commits
Murder.
well, what would it's premeditated murder, actually, yes.
An argument that, Uriah didn't do what David told him to do. David's king. David told him to go to your house. And he was away. And he didn't do it.
But
So generous. But I mean, your point is that Uriah was insubordinate. And the discipline was appropriate because he was insubordinate.
Well, where was his loyalty? Was his loyalty to David? Or was his loyalty?
the problem is the reader, though, folks, that's not the objective. There's no accusation. David doesn't even speak about insubordination. David, as the reader, as we, the readers, understand, this is an incredibly fine man, Uriah. And David is angry only because in a world without DNA, he can't absolve himself from really the act of adultery. And adultery is a very severe and punishable act. Let's read on, because I won't take any other comments, of course, but let's read on, because we'll see how God's reaction is in a moment here. But any other comments on this point up to where we left? Yes.
Just wonder about the idea that God understands that we human beings just cannot get it right.
Well, I have shared over the years with you a lecture that I attended years and years ago by Gunther Plaut, no longer alive, Bible scholar and a congregational rabbi in Toronto, I believe. And he gave a lecture in which I attended, and he poses the question, who's the most tragic figure in the Bible? And people would say Bathsheba, or people would say Sarah, or maybe they'd say Moses, and he would gently nod, and finally he would say God. God is the most tragic figure in the Bible. I've given you so much, people. And what do? You just throw it back at me, right? Yes, ma'am.
Not the general people around David knew that he had impregnated this woman?
Not the general people around him. Later, you get the sense that they knew. All right. And now some of that are superimposing our knowing with what we think people around him knew. One thing is for certain, Nathan the prophet knew. Some of his inner courtiers, no doubt, knew. And news spreads. Comment? No,
Yeah, one more
no.
just,
Yeah.
Hate to beat on that dead horse, but even to this day, I don't know if in the time of Israel at the time, this was an ethic. It certainly is an ethic today. That a man who stays behind in time of war and seduces the wife of a man who's at war is the most dishonorable man that there is.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no worse description of a human.
And it's very clear that the text is laying this on heavy. But why is it doing it, folks? What's underlying this, perhaps? Remember we talked about the pushback by the prophets, but also the general pushback and concern of having a king to begin with. This is the ultimate indictment, is it not? Don't nominate, don't elevate a king. But that is a political undertow, and there are others who say, no, do it. And then it's further complicated by those, and here we can superimpose biblical criticism, say the P document, the priestly document, who would be absolutely in favor of not what David is doing, but what ultimately David will lead to be done, and that is to build the temple in Jerusalem. He already has Jerusalem. And why would those who support the priestly or the P document be in favor of that? Because that is their seat of authority, the priests. You know, it's not a stretch saying this as a Jew here. And I actually believe this. I think Jesus, historic Jesus, in many ways, reflected a growing body of contemporaries, all Jews, who were disgusted with the priestly, just stronghold and mechanic religious expressions of its day. And there was, and we saw that there was, in retrospect, a change in the development of leadership. How did one become a priest? How is one a priest in Israel? By virtue of what? Birth, by whom or under whom? His father, the Levites, right? The tribe of Levi. I'm a Levite. You know why I'm a Levite? Because my dad's a Levite. And why is he a Levite? Because his dad was a Levite, and presumably all the way down the line. But big deal. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but big deal. You didn't earn it. I don't understand when people say I'm proud to be. You know, what does that mean? Now, if you say I'm proud that, you know, we worked hard and we sacrificed and we achieved and we contributed, that's another story. You know, I'm proud to have brown eyes. Wow. So, you know, very often we'll read this in a much more narrow plane, but now when we start superimposing, and it's interpretation and it's apologetics, and no apology for apologetics, and I'm not trying to be glib here, I'm not at all. No, that's important to explain. But what's underlying this? You know, that SOB king, we should have never had kings to begin with, and let me tell you why. By the way, David ends up with what? I think 8 wives and nearly a dozen concubines. Now, and we do know that marital unions were often made for political reasons. Hold your breath until Solomon comes along, right? All right, so that's one angle, but morally speaking, it's contemptible. And then if you want another angle of interpretation here, wow, the fact that it's even in the book. And I keep saying, wow. That's why I love the Bible so much. Not the only reason, please hear me. It is not. And I'm not backtracking here. But don't give me people that I can't relate to. I can't relate to this, by the way. I personally can. I really can't. I cannot relate to this. But I can understand, in terms of the unfolding mystery and the intrigue and the depravity as well. I think I can understand, or at least what have you. Yeah.
So you're foreshadowing a dimension of the story with Nathan, which goes beyond holding David accountable.
Oh, absolutely.
As the voice of God, Nathan articulated the voice of God. Nathan is the living and breathing Samuel, presumably, as opposed to rousting him up to the witch of Endor.
That's an excellent parallel. Yes.
And the story also frames a political tension between the prophetic interest, successor Samuel, versus the kingly, absolutist interest that ultimately won out to the,
Oh, and I would ramp it up five steps beyond that. The 12 tribes, the united tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes, there was never any love lost between them. They were at each other's throats. Think of the early formulation of the United States in terms of the political gerrymandering in order to keep the initial why am I drawing a blank? The initial colonies to unify them. And gerrymandering is really the verb here. They really were gerrymandered. No question about it. I'll give you a little of this, you give me a little of that, and let's get together here. But there were cultural differences, or there were economic differences, or there were, in some cases, religious differences. It is significant that Jerusalem was in the middle. I go back to this. It's significant that Jerusalem was a Jebusite city. It is in the tribe of Benjamin, but Benjamin is literally irrelevant. But even then, it was the Washington, D.C. of its day. It couldn't be claimed effectively by any of the tribes. And boy, was that a tightrope. And all hell's going to break loose once Solomon dies. We romanticize David because he held a very tight fist. He just did. Again, and I'm grandstanding of sorts here, but the point I hope is emphasized. He says, jump, how high? I'm just repeating myself here. Let me read on with you, okay? Here we are, chapter 12. But the Lord was displeased with what David had done. Oh. And the Lord sent Nathan. Nathan, Natan, means a gift. To David. He came to him and said, there were two men in the same city, one rich and one poor. The rich man had a very large flock and herds, but the poor man had only one little ewe lamb that he bought. He tended it and grew up together with him and his children. It used to share his morsel of bread, drink from his cup, and nestle in his bosom. It was like a daughter to him. One day, a traveler came to the rich man, but he was loath to take anything from his own flocks or herds to prepare a meal for the guest who had come to him. So he took the poor man's lamb and prepared it for the man who had come to him. David flew into a rage against the man and said to Nathan, as the Lord lives, the man who did this deserves to die. He shall pay for the lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and showed no pity. This, when you read it, and I don't mean to patronize, God forbid, but when you read it in the Hebrew, Nathan grabs metaphorically, David by the neck and says, and David said to David, the man is you. Atah ish is the Hebrew. You SOB, that's you.
Mhm.
Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. It was I who anointed you king over Israel, and it was I who rescued you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and possessions of your master's wives. And I gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if it were not enough, I would give you twice as much more. Why then have you flouted the command of the Lord and done what displeases him? You have put Uriah the Hittite to the sword. You took his wife and made her your wife and had him killed by the sword of the Ammonites. Therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you spurned me by taking the wife of Uriah the Hittite and making her your wife. Now, this is a very problematic piece of text as we unpack it. So let's look at a few of the reactions and also the punishments, okay? The reactions that David has specifically and the punishment that is meted out. The first is with regard to this lamb. What is David's reaction here? Initially, what does he say?
The man who's done this deserves to die.
Right, he deserves to die. Does he deserve to die? Is that skewed moral thought, accountability? The man took the wealthy man, and again, it plays on, you know, the one who's impoverished, and I understand that. All right, I've always felt there's no corollary between someone who's wealthy and decent versus someone who's a poor and decent or indecent, rich, decent or indecent. Runs the gamut. I don't have that sentimentality. I think there are many wealthy people who are saints and others who are scoundrels, and people who are not particularly wealthy who are scoundrels and also who are saints. I don't draw a distinction. I personally don't draw a distinction, not in any prejudiced manner here. I just don't. But does the person who took the lamb, the wealthy person who took the lamb to slaughter it, to feed to his guests, he deserves to die for that? I do worry about, now this is superimposing in the text, which I think we should always do when we read any piece, either of literature or biblical works. We bring ourselves to that text. I believe that's natural. I believe it's necessary. But I do worry about the lines being skewed between the value of animal life and human life. And I love animals, and I'm basically a vegetarian, I'm a pescatarian. I'm not saying this, look at me, I'm a paragon of virtue. I have had, and no doubt many of you have had pets that you considered a part of your family, but they're still a pet, they're still an animal. And this response, I think, also gives insight, perhaps, into an angle of David's moral character. Now, he was outraged, and we say things when we're angry that we don't necessarily mean or haven't thought out. I get that. And then he follows up that there should be monetary restitution. That I could not agree more soundly. Monetary restitution. Yeah.
It's not about David's response is not about the lamb.
Explain.
It's about the man.
It's about the man himself. Yes.
It's another man.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Agreed.
So he's establishing that David has a high sense of knowledge of right and wrong, and a high bar of justice. So he sets David up.
Agreed. But then he could have, and I would be pretty exacting in him having chosen different words. and I won't let this one go. I do think it was pointed at sympathy for the lamb, and yes, I agree, it was ultimately directed at the man who just took advantage of the poor man by literally just taking a beloved pet from his house. I wouldn't let that go, though. I personally would not let that go. Yes.
I'm interested that you draw that corollary using the lamb as an animal. And I wasn't seeing that at all. I was thinking of all of the things that David murdered. And not only the Uriah, but remember, he sends Boaz to do this. Boaz was totally knowledgeable. So you have sent him to do this awful thing. He takes in, there's a murder there, I believe. There's also the murder, even though Uriah dies, he's certainly, I believe he's fully knowledgeable about what has happened before. So his honor has been murdered. I think what David has done is dramatically wider than actually Bathsheba or the killing of Uriah. I think it's pervasive.
I could not agree more soundly. And what you're bringing out is valuable. Yes, good. In the best sense, good, absolutely. Could not agree more soundly. It's interesting here also, let's read on. What is the punishment here? And this is a curiosity of which I'm not sure I have an answer here. Nathan, of course, uses a story. Nathan cannot approach the king and say, you SOB, you scoundrel, you lowlife, I know what you did. He can't do that because David would push back and probably have, you want to talk about an additional killing, would have Nathan killed. Prophets were often the ones who would speak out in such a way that they would jeopardize their own lives by doing so. Certainly they would not win popularity. So he had to circumvent a direct accusation, and hence he develops this storyline. But what is really troubling, and this I just don't have an answer here, is God's response. God, of course, says, through channeling through Nathan, God did all these things for David and so on and so forth. But then what he says is that why you flouted my commandment and done displeases me and put Uriah in the sword. Therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house because you spurned me by taking the wife of Uriah the Hittite and so on. What is curious about this, given what you know about the Old Testament? This is a punishment that goes beyond the perpetrator. And what has always been consistent in biblical / Jewish thought is that the person responsible is the person who is punished. Now, you know as well as I do that there's a measure, a high measure often of stigma of family members who are implicated in a wrongdoing. Bernie Madoff was a scoundrel beyond words. And a generation yet to be born will be stigmatized because of what he did. And they're innocent. They're absolutely innocent, right? A generation unborn. His son did commit suicide. But the grandchildren or the great-grandchildren or generation beneath them, they're innocent. Pol Pot's family is stigmatized. Stalin. And I understand that societally, but not with divine decree here. This notion of holding the general family accountable. And that I find very problematic. Yes, please.
Well, I mean, there are Old Testament predicates for precedents for this, right? About generations suffering because of the sin of the
Which was essentially, that they will suffer for generations to come, which essentially was revisited in the book of Deuteronomy.
So one of the things that struck me, I appreciate you putting this in more of a political context. I wonder if this promise, David, you're going to be beset by the enemies of Israel throughout your reign, is actually a punishment visited upon the interests that wanted the king to the detriment of the prophetic judges. So that we're holding not only David accountable, but we're holding the whole group of you disobedient people for wanting a king when I, God, told you no kings. And nonetheless, you wanted a king, I acquiesced in you getting a king, and now you are, to borrow Senator Schumer's phrase, reaping the whirlwind of having done so. Is that an unjust?
No, I think that's a very fine interpretation. And here's where, again, with the height of respect, I would challenge all of you to do the same. Look, biblical scholarship chimes in and understands, or at least poses different case scenarios that underline what is called a superficial read of the text. And that's exactly what you're doing. Yes, I think it's all in bounds. And that's what's so powerful about this. Let me hold off on a few comments. I want to just get to something here. Yeah, go ahead.
The question is, could you reconcile that with the statement that God makes that vengeance is mine, I will repay. That sounds like vengeance.
It is clearly vengeance. It's punishment.
And God says, vengeance is my job. And so when God commits vengeance, he's doing what he said he could do.
I think you can, but listen, here we go into another area, and I've always loved study when it's the sidebars that are raised. I personally do that. I study. I'm with a small group, two other folks, and we're reading Maimonides. And you really have to know something about Greek philosophy. You have to know something about Christianity. You have to know something about Islam. You have to know something about medieval Judaism. And we're reading a text, his philosophical tome, Maimonides, the great Maimonides. And it's the sidebar discussions that often are the most challenging outside of the letter of the text. Hold the comments, folks, for a moment, all right? And let's just do a little bit more because we're narrowing to the end of our time here. David's response is a curious one. David said to Nathan in verse 13, I stand guilty before the Lord. And Nathan replied to David, the Lord has remitted your sin and you shall not die. However, since you have spurned the enemies of the Lord by this deed, even the child about to be born to you shall die. And this again is a head scratcher. An innocent baby. Now, how are you going to run with this in any direction? But this child, the concept of what's called mamza roots, illegitimate child, a bastard. It's a disgusting, disgusting concept. There are no illegitimate children. There are illegitimate parents. And all of it's shrapnel that's just flying in every direction now. And we, the consumers, we have to digest this, reject, bring in, be disgusted by, perhaps be, challenged and enthralled even, not as a voyeur. Heaven forfend, this is you, but the truth is, this is who we are, but it is who we are. The biggest battle all of us have is with ourselves. Who are we kidding? And this text brings it out. This is not Psych 101. It goes deeper than that. And it takes a supple mind, a mature individual to begin to fathom and struggle and acquiesce to what is being described here. The child dies. What did the child do? And you know what ends up happening? This is kind of curious also, that Bathsheba becomes David's wife. This daughter of the vow. This beloved, David, the beloved. It's just so, the twists, the turns, the cavernous, hollow description of narrative here. It just tugs at your heart and it challenges your mind. And then what's going to happen as we narrow our time together this morning is that Bathsheba and David will have another child, and that will be Solomon, and he'll compete with Ishbosheth, Saul's child, for who will ascend the throne. And it will be Solomon who will build the temple, because Solomon will prevail in Jerusalem. And David will die a peaceful death. And that's what ends up happening. And Nathan the prophet, in my estimation, is the unsung hero. We'll hear about Nathan in the book of Chronicles again, but this is really where he appears. Only here. There's no book of Nathan, as there is a book of Jeremiah or Isaiah or Habakkuk or Ezekiel. There's no book of Nathan. But Nathan, is he the conscience of David? Is he our own personal conscience? The person who can say, you know what, you're that person. And why are you doing that? And not only that, you're that person in the seat of authority. And one need not be a CEO to be in a seat of authority, or a senator, or a president. We're in the seat of authority within our own marriages, within our families. And then it's the house of Jesse, from which David himself is born, that in the book of Ruth, fascinating book by itself, where we'll have the line, the family tree that will give rise to a biblical notion of a Messiah, which is, and one of the reasons attributed to David, because the idea, a central idea of a Messiah, is a human being, presumably with the gift of persuasion or military prowess, who will once again reunite the 12 tribes of Israel. And they were never more united than under David's iron-gripped rule, which is a statement by itself. If that's what unites people, that ain't uniting people. If there is coercion, there's no free will. But here in the book of Ruth, I'm just going to skip ahead, and I want to read this to you, and then we'll conclude. Naomi took the child and held her to her bosom. She became its foster mother, and the women neighbors gave him a name, saying, "A son born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, father of David. This is the line of Peretz. Peretz begot Hirzon. Hirzon begot Ram. Ram begot Aminadab. Aminadab begot Nachshon. Nachshon begot Salmon. Salmon begot Boaz. Boaz begot Obed. Obed begot Jesse. And Jesse begot David. Why is the line of the Messiah from David? I'll leave that to your own devices. And I'm not ducking or shirking the question. I struggle with it as well. Might it also be telling us something with regard to, and this is partly my own bias, something that I've shared with you over the years theologically. I don't believe if the Messiah were to walk into this room or is in this room or we meet him along life's ways, that we would be told essentially anything different than what we've been told already as to how to treat one another, how to take responsibility. David doesn't even apologize for his wrongdoing. He acknowledges it, but he doesn't apologize. Why is it that the contemporary understanding is that the Messiah emanates from this family tree? It's a fair question. It's a tale that perhaps needs to be told, or is a tale that will continually unfold as we go through life's ways. A bit of a jump ball, and I'll leave that to your own devices. Good morning.
Rabbi,